Pay attention to the bearded activist raising the stone. His name is Haytham. He's about to destroy this Christian shrine with fellow protesters cheering. Then sudden wind strikes. Stone flies away. He falls trembling to his knees.
My name is Haytham. I'm 34 years old. On April 9th, 2021, I was leading Islamic protests against Christian symbols in our city. I thought I was defending Allah. I had no idea Jesus had different plans for my heart. My story begins in a household where hatred for Christianity wasn't just taught, it was breathed into every corner of our daily life. My father was a devout Muslim who believed that our neighborhood was under spiritual attack from Christian influences. He would point to the church bells that rang every Sunday morning and tell me they were calling demons into our sacred streets. As a young boy, I absorbed every word he spoke like gospel truth. Growing up, I watched my father's face twist with disgust whenever we passed by Christian symbols or saw people wearing crosses. He would spit on the ground and mutter prayers under his breath, asking Allah to cleanse the area of what he called Christian pollution. By the time I was 12 years old, I had learned to hate something I didn't even understand. The very sight of a crucifix would make my stomach turn with righteous anger. When I reached my 20s, this hatred had grown into something much more dangerous. I wasn't content to simply despise Christianity from a distance anymore. I wanted to take action. At age 25, I joined a local Islamic movement that shared my father's vision of purifying our community from Christian influences. These weren't moderate Muslims who preached tolerance and coexistence. These were men who believed that Islam's dominance required the complete removal of competing religious symbols. Our group met every Friday after prayers in the basement of a local mosque. The Imam would speak passionately about the need to reclaim our streets for Allah. He would tell us stories about how Christians were secretly trying to convert Muslim children through their displays and symbols. Every church sign, every religious statue, every cross was presented as evidence of a coordinated attack on our faith and our families. I threw myself into this cause with the fervor of a true believer. Every church bell I heard made my blood boil with what I believed was righteous anger. When I saw Christians walking to their Sunday services, I would imagine them as soldiers in an enemy army marching through our territory. The hatred consumed my thoughts during the day and invaded my dreams at night. I lived and breathed animosity toward anything connected to Jesus Christ. Our movement began organizing what we called cleansing protests. We would target specific Christian displays in public spaces and demand their removal. We started small, focusing on nativity scenes during Christmas and Easter decorations in shop windows. We would march with signs demanding respect for Muslim sensibilities and chant about protecting our children from Christian indoctrination. The local news covered our protests, and I felt proud to be defending Islam so publicly. But peaceful protests weren't enough for me anymore. I started pushing our group toward more direct action. I argued that simply asking for removal wasn't working fast enough. I convinced several of the younger members that we needed to take matters into our own hands. If the authorities wouldn't protect our community from Christian symbols, then we would protect ourselves. That's when we discovered the small shrine dedicated to St. Francis in the old quarter of our city. It sat quietly in a small plaza where elderly Christians would sometimes come to pray. The statue wasn't large or imposing, but to me it represented everything wrong with our neighborhood. Here was a Christian saint displayed openly in what I considered Muslim territory, drawing Christian worshippers to our streets every single day. I became obsessed with this shrine. I would drive past it multiple times each week, studying its location and planning how we could remove it. I researched the legal pathways for getting it taken down, but the city council kept rejecting our petitions. The shrine had historical significance, they claimed, and removing it would violate religious freedom protections. Their refusal only fueled my anger further. During our Friday meetings, I would bring up the shrine constantly. I showed the group photographs I had taken and argued that this statue was a direct insult to every Muslim in our city. I painted pictures of Christian missionaries using the shrine as a rallying point to convert our youth. I convinced them that every day we allowed it to stand, we were failing in our duty to protect Islam. The other members of our group began to share my obsession. We would drive to the shrine together and stand around it, discussing how offensive its presence was in our community. We started bringing stones and rocks, telling ourselves we were just expressing our frustration. But deep down, I knew we were preparing for something more destructive. Ask yourself this question: have you ever felt hatred so pure that it consumed every rational thought in your mind? That's where I was living every single day. The shrine became the focus of every angry prayer I offered to Allah. I begged Him to give me the strength and opportunity to remove this Christian pollution from our streets once and for all. I recruited 15 of our most dedicated members for what I told them would be our most important protest yet. We weren't going to simply stand around with signs this time. We were going to take direct action to protect our community. I armed myself and my followers with stones and rocks, telling them we were prepared for spiritual warfare against the enemies of Islam. The night before our planned action, I lay awake praying to Allah for success. I asked Him to bless our mission and to give me the strength to strike the decisive blow against this Christian symbol. I had convinced myself that destroying this shrine would be an act of worship, a demonstration of my devotion to Islam that would inspire other Muslims to take similar action. Looking back now, I can see how completely I had surrendered my heart to hatred. But at that moment, as I prepared to lead my followers to the shrine, I believed I was about to perform the most righteous act of my entire life. I had no idea that I was walking directly into an encounter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about God. The morning of April 9th, 2021, arrived with perfect weather for what I believed would be our most important mission. I woke up before dawn and performed my prayers with unusual intensity, asking Allah to bless our actions and give us courage for the battle ahead. I dressed in my best traditional clothing, wanting to look dignified as I led this sacred cleansing of our neighborhood. I had arranged to meet my 15 followers at the local mosque parking lot at 2 in the afternoon. As each man arrived, I could see the same fire in their eyes that burned in my own heart. These weren't casual protesters or weekend activists. These were true believers who shared my conviction that Christian symbols had no place in our community. The younger brother of our group's treasurer carried a canvas bag filled with stones we had collected from construction sites around the city. The local shopkeeper who had joined us the previous months brought his teenage son, eager to show the boy what defending Islam looked like in practice. We gathered in a tight circle as I explained our mission one final time. I told them we weren't going to the shrine as tourists or curious observers. We were going as soldiers of Allah, prepared to remove a symbol that insulted our faith every single day it remained standing. I reminded them that peaceful protests and legal petitions had failed completely. The city council had ignored our demands, and the local Christians continued to use this shrine as if our objections meant nothing. The march to the old quarter took about 20 minutes, and with each step, my anger grew more intense. I could feel the righteous fury building in my chest as we walked through streets where church bells had rung for decades. Every cross we passed on our way to the shrine felt like a personal insult to my family and my faith. The local mechanic who walked beside me kept muttering prayers under his breath, asking Allah to guide our hands and strengthen our resolve. When we finally reached the small plaza where the shrine stood, I felt my hatred crystallize into pure determination. There it was, exactly as I remembered from my countless surveillance visits. The statue of St. Francis stood peacefully on its stone pedestal, surrounded by small flowers that local Christians had placed there during their morning prayers. To them, this might have been a symbol of love and devotion. To me, it represented everything that was wrong with our neighborhood's spiritual landscape. I positioned my followers in a semicircle around the shrine, making sure we surrounded it completely. I wanted any passing Christians to see that we had claimed this space for Islam. The university student who had joined our movement just 2 months earlier started taking photographs, documenting what he believed would be a historic moment for our community. The elderly carpenter who had known my father for decades stood directly behind me, ready to support whatever action I decided to take. Standing before the shrine, I began speaking loudly about the offense this statue represented to every Muslim in our city. My voice carried across the plaza as I explained to my followers why this moment was so crucial for our faith. I pointed at the statue and declared that Saint Francis had no authority in Muslim territory. I reminded them that allowing Christian symbols to remain in our neighborhood sent a message of weakness to our enemies and confusion to our children. The crowd behind me began responding with enthusiasm, shouting their agreement and encouraging me to continue. The local taxi driver started chanting anti-Christian slogans, while a young pharmacy assistant raised his fist in solidarity. I could feel their energy feeding my own anger, pushing me toward actions I had only imagined during my private moments of rage. But speaking wasn't enough anymore. Words had failed us for months, and I knew that dramatic action was required to send the message our community needed to hear. I looked at the peaceful expression carved into St. Francis's stone face and felt an overwhelming urge to wipe it away forever. This statue represented every unanswered prayer for Christian removal, every ignored petition to the city council, every moment of frustration I had experienced watching Christians treat our neighborhood like their own religious playground. I began moving from passionate speech toward physical confrontation. I approached the statue and placed my hands on its base, testing its stability and planning how to bring it down most effectively. The local blacksmith called out his encouragement, telling me that Allah would bless whatever action I took against this Christian pollution. The retired teacher who had been attending our meetings since the beginning started reciting Quranic verses about fighting against the enemies of Islam. My followers sensed that we were moving beyond mere protest into direct action. They pressed closer to the shrine, creating an intimidating presence that would discourage any Christians from interfering with our mission. The young electrician began distributing stones from our canvas bag, while the middle-aged accountant started recording video on his phone, wanting to capture our victory for later sharing with other Islamic groups. Something demonic in me decided that this shrine must be completely destroyed, not damaged or defaced, but utterly demolished, so that no trace of St. Francis would remain in our neighborhood. I had spent too many sleepless nights thinking about this statue, too many Friday prayers asking Allah for the strength to remove it. The time for half measures and symbolic gestures had passed completely. I bent down and selected the largest stone I could find from our collection. It was roughly the size of a volleyball, heavy enough to do serious damage to the carved statue. As I lifted it above my head, I felt the weight of every Christian insult I believed our community had endured. This single blow would send a message that Muslims would no longer tolerate Christian symbols in our sacred spaces. The crowd behind me fell silent, sensing that the decisive moment had arrived. Every eye was focused on my raised hands and the stone that would soon crash into St. Francis's peaceful face. I had reached the point of no return, the moment where years of hatred would finally transform into irreversible action. The moment I raised that stone above my head, time seemed to slow down in the most extraordinary way. I could feel every muscle in my arms straining under the weight of the rock, and I could see the carved face of St. Francis looking up at me with what appeared to be complete peace. My followers behind me had gone completely silent, waiting for the sound of stone crashing against statue that would mark our victory over Christian presence in our neighborhood. But then something happened that defied every natural law I thought I understood about the world. The day had been perfectly calm, without even the slightest breeze stirring the leaves on the nearby trees. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and still air throughout the afternoon. Yet suddenly, from absolutely nowhere, a wind began to build around the shrine with an intensity I had never experienced in my entire life. This wasn't a gentle gust or a normal change in weather patterns. This was a focused, powerful force that seemed to emerge from the ground, beneath the statue itself. The wind hit me with such unexpected violence that my entire body lurched backward, completely disrupting my balance and my grip on the stone. I felt my fingers losing their hold on the rock, despite my desperate attempts to maintain control and complete my mission. The stone that I had intended to hurl at St. Francis was literally ripped from my hands by this supernatural wind. Instead of flying toward the statue as I had planned, it sailed harmlessly away from the shrine and crashed into the empty plaza behind my followers. The sound of the rock hitting the ground echoed across the space like a gunshot, but the statue remained completely untouched and undamaged. The force of the wind knocked me completely off my feet, sending me tumbling backward onto the hard stone pavement of the plaza. I hit the ground with enough impact to drive the air from my lungs and send sharp pain shooting through my back and shoulders. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the shock of what had just occurred. In all my years of planning this moment, I had never considered the possibility that nature itself might intervene to protect the Christian shrine. As I lay on the ground, struggling to catch my breath, I became aware that my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. My hands were trembling so violently that I couldn't make them still, and my legs felt like they had turned to water beneath me. This wasn't the normal adrenaline response I had experienced during previous protests. This was something entirely different, something that seemed to originate from deep within my soul, rather than from my nervous system. The wind continued to swirl around the shrine for several more seconds, creating a small whirlwind that lifted dust and debris into the air around the statue. But the strangest part was that this powerful force seemed to affect only the immediate area around St. Francis. The rest of the plaza remained completely calm, as if an invisible barrier protected the shrine while allowing the supernatural wind to demonstrate its power. I tried to push myself up from the ground, but my arms wouldn't support my weight. Every time I attempted to stand, my muscles would give out and I would collapse back onto the pavement. The rational part of my mind kept telling me that this was just a freak weather event, a coincidence that had nothing to do with the statue or my intentions. But deep in my heart, I knew I was experiencing something that couldn't be explained by natural causes. My followers stood frozen in complete shock, staring at me as I struggled helplessly on the ground. The university student who had been taking photographs had lowered his camera and was backing away from the shrine with obvious fear in his eyes. The local mechanic, who had been muttering prayers just moments before, was now completely silent, his face pale and confused. None of them had ever seen anything like what had just occurred, and they clearly didn't know how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. As the supernatural wind finally began to subside, I felt something even more disturbing than the physical manifestation I had just witnessed. An overwhelming sense of presence settled over the entire plaza, as if invisible eyes were watching every move I made and every thought that crossed my mind. This wasn't the comforting presence of Allah that I had experienced during my most devoted prayers. This was something entirely different, something that felt both foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely powerless in the face of forces beyond my understanding or control. All my careful planning and righteous anger seemed pathetic and insignificant compared to the power that had just demonstrated its ability to stop my actions with effortless ease. I had come to this shrine believing I was serving Allah by destroying Christian symbols, but now I questioned everything I thought I knew about spiritual warfare and divine will. The trembling in my hands spread throughout my entire body as I finally managed to roll over and push myself up to my knees. But instead of standing up and rallying my followers for another attempted destruction, I found myself remaining in that kneeling position as if some invisible force was holding me there. My mind raced with questions I had never allowed myself to ask before this moment. Then, without any conscious decision on my part, words began forming in my mouth that I had never spoken before in my entire life. Despite decades of Islamic teaching and years of anti Christian activism, I heard myself saying, Jesus, forgive me. The words came from somewhere deeper than my rational thoughts, emerging from a part of my soul that seemed to recognize the truth of what had just occurred. The moment those words left my lips, the overwhelming presence I had felt around the shrine seemed to intensify rather than diminish. But instead of the threatening or judgmental energy I might have expected from a Christian deity, I experienced something that felt like pure love washing over my entire being. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered during years of Islamic prayer and meditation. The supernatural peace that washed over me while kneeling before that shrine was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 34 years of life. It felt as if warm liquid was flowing through every cell in my body, replacing decades of accumulated hatred with something I couldn't even name. My hands gradually stopped shaking, and for the first time since hitting the ground, I felt strong enough to attempt standing up again. As I slowly rose to my feet, I became acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted inside my heart. The rage that had driven me to this plaza just minutes earlier had completely vanished, replaced by an inexplicable sense of calm that seemed to originate from outside my own consciousness. I looked up at the statue of St. Francis, and instead of seeing an enemy symbol that needed destroying, I saw the face of someone who might actually understand the transformation happening within me. My followers were backing away from me with expressions of fear and confusion written across their faces. The local mechanic who had walked beside me during our march was shaking his head and muttering under his breath about evil spirits and Christian magic. The university student had completely stopped taking photographs and was edging toward the plaza exit as if he couldn't get away from me fast enough. Their reaction told me that whatever had happened to me was visible to everyone present. The young electrician who had been distributing stones just moments before dropped his remaining rocks and started walking rapidly away from the shrine. He kept looking back over his shoulder at me as if I had become something dangerous or contaminated. The elderly carpenter who had known my father for decades called out to me, demanding to know what had happened and why I was acting so strangely. But I couldn't find words to explain something I didn't understand myself. One by one, my followers abandoned me in that plaza. The local shopkeeper grabbed his teenage son and pulled him away while muttering prayers for protection against whatever force had taken control of me. The middle-aged accountant who had been recording our mission stopped his video and hurried after the others, clearly wanting no association with whatever spiritual event had just occurred. Within 5 minutes, I stood completely alone beside the shrine I had come to destroy. The isolation should have frightened me, but instead it felt like exactly what I needed to process what had just happened. I walked slowly around the statue, seeing it with completely new eyes. The carved features that had previously filled me with murderous rage now appeared gentle and welcoming. The flowers that local Christians had placed around the base looked like offerings of love rather than symbols of territorial invasion. Everything about this shrine that had once offended me now seemed beautiful and peaceful. I attempted to leave the plaza several times during those first minutes after my followers departed, but something kept drawing me back to the statue. Each time I started walking toward the street, I would feel an overwhelming urge to return and spend more time in the presence of St. Francis. It was as if the peace I had experienced during that supernatural encounter was somehow connected to this specific location, and leaving would mean losing that incredible sense of calm. The tears that began flowing down my face caught me completely off guard. I hadn't cried since childhood, and I certainly had never wept in public where strangers might see my vulnerability. But the emotional release felt as involuntary and necessary as breathing. Years of accumulated anger and hatred seemed to be washing out of my system through those tears, making room for feelings I had never allowed myself to experience. As afternoon turned toward evening, I found myself sitting on a bench across from the shrine, unable to tear my eyes away from the statue that had become the center of my spiritual earthquake. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that what I had experienced was some kind of psychological break triggered by stress and fanaticism. But my heart knew with absolute certainty that I had encountered something supernatural, something that had chosen to reveal itself through an act of mercy rather than judgment. The first Christians who came for evening prayers found me still sitting there as darkness began to fall across the plaza. An elderly woman approached the shrine carrying fresh flowers, and when she saw me watching her, she smiled with genuine warmth and asked if I was all right. I couldn't bring myself to tell her that just hours earlier I had tried to destroy the very shrine where she was now praying. Instead, I simply nodded and watched as she arranged the flowers with obvious love and devotion. Walking home that night felt like moving through a completely different world than the one I had inhabited that morning. The church bells that had always filled me with rage now sounded like beautiful music calling people to worship. The crosses I passed on buildings and signs no longer appeared as symbols of invasion, but as reminders of sacrifice and love. My entire perception of Christianity had undergone a complete reversal in the span of a few hours. I couldn't sleep that night, and it wasn't because of physical discomfort from my fall in the plaza. My mind was racing with questions I had never allowed myself to consider before. If Jesus had the power to stop my attack on that shrine, what did that say about everything I had been taught regarding his nature and authority? If a Christian saint could somehow hold down supernatural wind to protect his statue, what other spiritual realities had I been blind to during my years of Islamic activism? The peace I had experienced at the shrine stayed with me through that sleepless night, creating a stark contrast to the inner turmoil that had dominated my thoughts for years. Instead of the constant anger and planning for religious warfare that usually filled my mind, I felt surrounded by a presence that seemed to whisper reassurance and love. It was the most restful sleeplessness I had ever experienced. By morning, I knew that returning to my old life was impossible. Something had fundamentally changed in my relationship with the spiritual world, and I couldn't pretend that my encounter at the shrine had been a meaningless coincidence. I needed to understand what had happened to me, and that meant doing something I had sworn I would never do. I needed to learn about Jesus Christ from people who actually followed him. The morning after my encounter at the shrine, I woke up with an overwhelming compulsion to seek out someone who could explain what had happened to me. I knew I couldn't discuss this with anyone from my mosque or my Islamic activist group. They would either dismiss my experience as psychological breakdown or declare me possessed by evil spirits. I needed to speak with someone who understood the Christian faith from the inside. Finding the courage to walk into a church felt like the most terrifying thing I had ever attempted. I drove past 3 different churches that morning before finally parking outside a small building with a simple wooden cross above the door. My hands were shaking as I sat in my car, trying to work up the nerve to go inside and expose my spiritual confusion to strangers who had every reason to distrust me. The pastor who answered the door was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. When I told him I needed to speak with someone about a spiritual experience involving Jesus, he invited me into his office without asking any questions about my background or religious affiliation. I sat across from his desk and began telling him everything that had happened at the shrine. From my years of anti-Christian activism to the supernatural wind that had stopped my attack, he listened to my entire story without interrupting or showing any signs of judgment. Even when I described my hatred for Christianity and my intention to destroy the statue of Saint Francis. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for several moments before saying that what I had experienced sounded like a divine encounter designed to get my attention and open my heart to God's love. He explained that Jesus often revealed himself to people in dramatic ways when they needed radical transformation. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to that church almost daily. The pastor began meeting with me regularly to answer my questions about Christian faith and to help me understand what it might mean to follow Jesus. He gave me a Bible and encouraged me to read the Gospels, particularly the stories of how Jesus interacted with people who had previously been his enemies or opponents. Reading about Jesus for the first time was a revelation that shook me to my core. Every page contradicted what I had been taught about Christian beliefs during my Islamic upbringing. Instead of finding a vengeful deity who demanded violence against non-believers, I discovered a savior who preached love for enemies and forgiveness for those who had committed terrible sins. The Jesus I encountered in Scripture was nothing like the caricature I had been fighting against for years. The internal struggle during those early weeks was more intense than anything I had experienced during my most passionate Islamic devotions. Part of me still wanted to return to the familiar certainty of my previous faith, while another part of me was drawn irresistibly towards the love and grace I was discovering in Christianity. I would spend hours each night wrestling with questions about loyalty to my family heritage versus following what felt like divine calling. Meanwhile, my behavior changes were becoming impossible to hide from my family and former associates. I stopped attending Friday prayers at the mosque, claiming work obligations whenever my father asked why I was absent, I avoided the other Islamic activists who had participated in our shrine protest, making excuses when they called to discuss future actions. My wife began asking pointed questions about why I seemed so distracted and why I was spending so much time away from home. The crisis came when one of my former followers saw me leaving the church after a Bible study session. The university student who had been taking photographs during our failed shrine attack confronted me in the parking lot, demanding to know why I was consorting with Christians. When I couldn't give him a satisfactory explanation, he immediately called other members of our group to report what he had witnessed. Within hours, my father was at my door with 3 other men from our mosque. They had come to perform what they called an intervention, convinced that I was under some kind of Christian spell that needed to be broken through intensive Islamic prayer and counseling. When I tried to explain that my interest in Christianity was voluntary and based on genuine spiritual seeking, my father's disappointment turned to rage. The confrontation with my family was more painful than any physical persecution I could have imagined. My father declared that I was no longer his son if I continued pursuing Christian teachings. My mother wept openly while begging me to return to Islam before I brought shame on our entire extended family. My younger brother threatened to cut off all contact unless I immediately ended my involvement with the church and publicly renounced any interest in Jesus. When I refused to abandon my spiritual journey, the consequences came swiftly and decisively. My father contacted the owner of the business where I had worked for 8 years, explaining that his son had become involved with Christians and could no longer be trusted. Within a week, I lost my job under pressure from Islamic community leaders who threatened to boycott any company that employed someone they considered a religious traitor. My former friends from the mosque began a campaign of social isolation designed to pressure me into returning to Islam. They would follow me when I went to the grocery store, loudly discussing my supposed apostasy where other Muslims could hear. They left threatening messages on my phone, warning that continued involvement with Christianity would result in permanent exile from the only community I had ever known. But the most difficult part of this persecution was watching how it affected my immediate family. My wife was torn between loyalty to me and pressure from her own relatives to divorce a husband who was flirting with Christianity. My young children began coming home from school with questions about why their classmates were saying their father had betrayed Islam. The pain in their eyes was almost enough to make me abandon my spiritual seeking and return to my previous life. Yet, through all this external pressure and internal anguish, I continued to experience the same supernatural peace that had first touched me at the shrine. Every time I prayed to Jesus, I felt the presence that had initially overwhelmed me during that failed protest. The love I encountered in my relationship with Christ sustained me through the darkest moments of rejection and isolation. 6 months after my encounter at the shrine, I made the decision that would permanently separate me from my Islamic past. I asked the pastor to baptize me as a public declaration of my faith in Jesus Christ. The ceremony took place in the same church where I had first sought answers about my spiritual experience, surrounded by the Christian brothers and sisters who had welcomed Me, despite knowing about my previous hatred for their faith, standing in that baptismal pool, surrounded by the Christian community that had embraced me despite knowing about my violent past, I felt the final pieces of my old identity washing away in the water. The pastor, who had patiently answered my questions for 6 months, lowered me beneath the surface, and when I emerged, I knew that Haytham, the Islamic activist, had died forever. In his place stood someone entirely new, someone who had been reborn through the grace of Jesus Christ. The years since my baptism have been filled with opportunities to serve God in ways I never could have imagined during my days of religious hatred. I began working with other former Islamic radicals who had encountered Jesus, helping them navigate the same family rejection and community persecution that I had experienced. There's something powerful about sharing your testimony with someone who understands the specific pain of choosing Christ over cultural expectations and family loyalty. My ministry expanded as word spread through underground networks about the former activist who had tried to destroy a Christian shrine but ended up surrendering his life to Jesus instead. I started receiving phone calls from Muslims across the country who had experienced their own supernatural encounters with Christ but didn't know how to process what had happened to them. Many of them had been afraid to seek help from Christians, fearing judgment or rejection, but they felt safe talking to someone who had walked the same difficult path. One of the most meaningful aspects of my new calling involves returning regularly to the shrine where my transformation began. Every week, I spend time in prayer at the exact spot where I had fallen to my knees 3 years ago, thanking Jesus for his mercy and asking for continued strength to serve him faithfully. The statue of St. Francis has become a personal symbol of God's ability to transform the most hardened hearts through supernatural encounters with his love. But the most incredible part of my story happened just last year, when I had the opportunity to participate in the shrine's restoration project. The years had taken their toll on the statue and surrounding area, and the local Christian community organized an effort to repair and beautify this sacred space. When I volunteered to help, many people were amazed that the same hands that had once tried to destroy St. Francis were now working carefully to restore him to his original glory. Working alongside other Christians to rebuild what I had attempted to tear down felt like the ultimate expression of redemption. Every stone I placed, every flower I planted around the base of the statue served as a physical reminder that Jesus specializes in making all things new. The other volunteers knew my story, and they would often comment on the incredible grace required to transform a destroyer into a restorer. My relationship with my family remains complicated, but not without hope. My father still refuses to speak with me directly, but my mother has begun having secret conversations about my faith journey. She recently told me that while she cannot understand my decision to follow Jesus, she cannot deny the obvious peace and joy that have replaced the anger and hatred that once consumed my life. My younger brother has started asking questions about Christianity, though he's careful to do so when our father isn't around. The most surprising development came when my wife, after 2 years of watching my transformation, began attending church services with me occasionally. She hasn't made any commitment to Christ yet, but she's genuinely curious about the face that completely changed her husband's character. My children have adapted better than I expected, and they're proud to tell their friends that their father helps other people find peace with God. Now, ask yourself this question: what would it take for Jesus to get your attention the way he got mine? I thought I was serving God faithfully through my Islamic activism, but I was actually fighting against the very Savior who wanted to transform my life. How many of you are resisting God's call because you're convinced you already know everything you need to know about spiritual truth? I'm telling you this as someone who spent years as Christ's enemy before becoming his follower. Jesus is not interested in your religious resume or your cultural background. He's interested in your heart, and he will go to extraordinary lengths to reach you if you're willing to respond to his love. The same supernatural power that stopped my hand from destroying that shrine is available to stop whatever destructive patterns are keeping you from experiencing God's peace in your own life. Every person I counsel who is struggling with the decision to follow Christ eventually asks me the same question: is losing everything for Jesus really worth it? My answer is always the same: I didn't lose anything of real value when I chose Christ. I lost hatred, anger, spiritual darkness, and the exhausting burden of trying to earn God's favor through religious performance. What I gained was peace, purpose, unconditional love, and the confidence that my eternity is secure in Jesus. The shrine where my journey began has become a place of pilgrimage for me, but not in the traditional religious sense. It's where I go to remember that God's grace is bigger than human hatred, that supernatural love can overcome natural enmity, and that Jesus really does have the power to make his enemies into his beloved children. Every time I kneel at that spot, I'm overwhelmed by gratitude for the divine intervention that literally knocked me off my feet and onto my knees. I'm asking you, just as someone who has been on both sides of this spiritual battle would ask, don't wait for your own dramatic divine intervention to get your attention. The same Jesus who protected that shrine from my violence wants to protect you from whatever spiritual forces are trying to destroy your relationship with God. He's calling you today, not with supernatural wind or miraculous signs, but through the simple message that his love is available to anyone willing to receive it. This is where my real life began, kneeling in the feet before Christian saints' shrine while experiencing the overwhelming love of Jesus Christ. The question I want to leave with you is this: where will your real life begin? Jesus is waiting for your answer, and unlike my violent approach to his shrine, he will never force you to respond. But he's hoping you'll choose the same transformation that changed everything for me. The same Jesus who stopped my hand from destroying that shrine is the same Jesus who wants to rebuild your life from whatever ruins sin and rebellion have created. Where will you allow that rebuilding to begin?